On July 16, 1546, the broken body of Anne Askew was carried to Smithfield, a place infamous for public executions. But why did a young noblewoman become such a threat to Henry's rule that she had to be tortured and silenced forever? Born in 1521 into a noble Lincolnshire family, she was highly educated and unshakable in her Protestant faith. From an early age, Anne questioned Catholic teachings, a dangerous stance in a country where religious beliefs could be a matter of life and death. But her defiance truly began when she was forced into an unhappy marriage with Thomas Kyme, a staunch Catholic. Anne's father had originally arranged for her elder sister to marry Thomas Kyme, but when her sister died, Anne was forced to take her place. She had no love for her husband, and worse, she had no love for his religion. While Kyme expected her to be a dutiful Catholic wife, Anne openly rejected Catholic teachings and embraced Protestantism. Her refusal to conform eventually led to her being thrown out of her own home. But instead of seeking refuge in silence, Anne took her newfound freedom as an opportunity to preach. In 1546, England was a dangerous place for anyone who dared to question the king's version of Christianity. By the time Anne Askew was arrested, Henry had turned into a paranoid and ruthless ruler. He didn't just punish Catholics who remained loyal to the Pope. He also went after Protestants who pushed for further reforms. So when Anne refused to accept the doctrine of transubstantiation, the belief that bread and wine in communion literally turn into Christ's body and blood, she became a target. In Henry's England, denying this teaching wasn't just heresy, it was treason, and treason meant death. That's when the order came. Anne Askew was to be arrested, interrogated, and forced to confess. Anne Askew had already been arrested once before. In 1545, she was taken into custody for preaching Protestant beliefs that directly challenged the doctrines of the Church of England. But thanks to her noble connections, she was eventually released. However, the warning did nothing to silence her. By 1546, her defiance had drawn the attention of powerful men in Henry VIII's court, men who were determined to root out Protestant heretics. This time Anne would not escape so easily. In May 1546, Anne was arrested again in London. But this time her enemies weren't just after her. They believed she had connections to high-ranking women at court who secretly supported Protestant reforms. The real prize wasn't just Anne. It was the influential Protestant figures she might expose under interrogation. She was taken to Sadler's Wells for questioning, where she was interrogated about her beliefs. The key issue? Transubstantiation. The idea that the bread and wine in communion literally transformed into the body and blood of Christ. Anne, unwavering in her faith, rejected the idea completely. When asked what she believed, she responded, "As for that, I will not sing a new song of the Lord in a strange land." It was a calculated answer. She neither confirmed nor denied the doctrine outright, but her refusal to accept it outright sealed her fate. Anne was soon transferred to the infamous Tower of London, where interrogations turned into something far worse: physical torture. Most prisoners, especially noblewomen, were spared the horrors of the rack. But Anne Askew was different. The men in charge of her questioning, Chancellor Thomas Wriothesley and Bishop Stephen Gardiner, were desperate to make her confess and betray any Protestant allies in the royal court. She was stripped and placed on the rack, a brutal device designed to stretch the body, dislocating joints and tearing muscles apart. As the handles were turned, her limbs were pulled further and further until her shoulders and hips were dislocated. Still, Anne refused to break. Even the Tower's lieutenant, Sir Anthony Knivet, was horrified by what was happening. He later reported that when he saw the extent of her suffering, he refused to continue. But Wriothesley and his men took matters into their own hands, personally turning the rack even further. By the time the torture was over, Anne's body was broken. She could no longer walk, but even then she refused to name any of her Protestant supporters. Despite her injuries, Anne was dragged to trial, where she was accused of heresy. She was asked once again if she believed in transubstantiation. Her answer remained the same. She rejected it. The outcome was inevitable. She was sentenced to be burned at the stake. But what made her execution even more horrifying was the fact that she was in no condition to stand. By the time of her burning, Anne Askew had to be carried to the stake in a chair, her body so broken from torture that she could no longer walk. Her fate was sealed, and what followed was one of the most brutal executions in Tudor history. In June 1546, Anne was brought before a panel of judges accused of heresy for denying the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation. This was not a fair trial. It was a public demonstration of royal power. The court was filled with officials loyal to King Henry VIII, including Bishop Stephen Gardiner, a fierce persecutor of Protestants. Anne, despite her frail and tortured body, remained defiant. She refused to acknowledge that the bread and wine in communion literally became the body and blood of Christ. This was the key doctrine that Henry's religious authorities were desperate to enforce, and Anne's denial was considered treason against both the Church and the Crown. When asked if she would recant her beliefs and accept the king's religious doctrine, Anne simply replied, "I had rather to read 5 lines in the Bible than to hear 5 masses in the temple." Her refusal enraged her accusers. They demanded she reveal the names of others who shared her beliefs, particularly noblewomen at Henry's court suspected of Protestant sympathies. But even after being brutally tortured on the rack, Anne did not betray anyone. This defiance only further sealed her fate. She was found guilty of heresy and sentenced to death by burning at the stake. Anne's execution was set for July 16, 1546, at Smithfield, a common site for burning heretics. However, there was something particularly horrifying about her situation. She'd been tortured so severely that she could no longer walk. Normally, a condemned person would be led to the stake, but Anne had to be carried there in a chair. Her body was so broken from the rack that she could not stand, but even in her weakest state, her spirit remained unbroken. As she was taken to her place of execution, she knew that this was not just a punishment. It was a spectacle meant to strike fear into anyone who dared to challenge the king's authority. But Anne Askew was about to become something far more powerful than a victim. She was about to become a martyr. On July 16, 1546, the broken body of Anne Askew was carried to Smithfield, a place infamous for public executions. But she was not alone. 3 other condemned Protestants, John Lascelles, John Hadlam, and Nicholas Belenian, were to be burned alongside her. Their crime? Rejecting the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation, just as Anne had. The execution was designed to be a message, a final warning to any who dared defy King Henry VIII's religious authority. But what made Anne's execution particularly horrifying was the state she was in. She had been tortured so brutally on the rack that she could not stand. Instead of walking to the stake, she had to be carried in a chair and tied to the post. Even as she faced death, Anne refused to show fear. Witnesses reported that she remained composed, her spirit unshaken despite the pain she had endured. Before the fire was lit, officials gave her one last chance to recant her beliefs. If she publicly accepted transubstantiation and swore loyalty to the king's doctrine, she might be spared. But Anne, with what little strength remained in her broken body, refused to renounce her faith. As the executioners set the wood and straw alight, flames began to consume the bodies of the condemned. Normally, burning at the stake was an excruciatingly slow death, with victims suffocating or dying from the heat before the flames fully engulfed them. However, Anne's execution had a cruel twist. It is believed that King Henry VIII, or one of his officials, ordered the use of gunpowder placed at Anne's feet. This was sometimes done as an act of mercy, ensuring a quicker death when the flames ignited the explosive. But whether the gunpowder worked or not, Anne Askew died in agony, her body reduced to ashes before the eyes of the crowd. Among the spectators were King Henry VIII's spies, noblemen, and commoners. Some watched in horror, while others saw it as a warning. But no one could deny that Anne had died unbroken, refusing to betray her beliefs until the very end.